You have entered Michael Baker Street Mysteries, where clues whisper in silence. Kindly like and subscribe to Michael Baker Street Mysteries. Which part of the world are you watching from? The case starts now. Chapter I.F.A. The Locked Room. It was upon a damp and wind-brushed evening in October that Sherlock Holmes was summoned from Baker Street to a tall Georgian residence overlooking the sombre reaches of Hampstead Heath. The sky hung low and sullen, its mist coiling about the iron railings and drifting in pale sheets across the heath. Beyond, gas lamps shimmered in the moisture like distant, uncertain stars. The house itself, of sober brick and symmetrical windows, rose with the quiet authority of inherited wealth. Yet the agitation within its walls was palpable even before we crossed the threshold. Our client, Mr. Edwin Whitmore, received us in a drawing room heavy with velvet draperies and ancestral portraits. He was a gentleman of some 50 years, spare of frame, his hair prematurely silvered and his manner composed only by visible effort. His sister's daughter, Miss Clara Whitmore, heiress to a considerable estate and last surviving child of the late Sir Julian Whitmore, had disappeared from her chamber the previous night under circumstances which defied ordinary explanation. She retired at 10:30, Mr. Whitmore informed us, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. She appeared in excellent spirits. Indeed, she had spent the evening writing letters and speaking of a charitable project she intended to fund before Christmas. There was no hint of distress. And yet, Holmes observed gently, by morning, she was gone. Vanished, Mr. Whitmore replied hoarsely. The door locked from within, the key found upon her writing desk, the windows secured, no sign of violence. The servants swear they neither heard nor saw anything untoward. Holmes inclined his head, and without further comment, requested to be shown the chamber in question. We ascended a broad staircase, whose banister bore the polish of generations. The upper corridor stretched long and straight, carpeted in a subdued Persian runner. At its far end stood the door to Miss Whitmore's room, a solid panel of mahogany, unmarred by force. A maid, pale and wide-eyed, withdrew as we approached. Holmes paused before entering, his fingers lightly tracing the molding about the frame. He examined the keyhole, the hinges, the jamb, with that silent absorption which I had come to recognize as the herald of his most penetrating thought. Then he stepped inside. The chamber was spacious and orderly. Pale morning light filtered through lace curtains drawn halfway across two tall sash windows overlooking the heath. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. The bed was neatly arranged, its counterpane undisturbed save for a shallow depression upon one pillow, as though its occupant had lain down but briefly. A dressing table stood opposite, and near the hearth, a small escritoire, upon which rested writing materials and correspondence. The key lay precisely where Mr. Whitmore had described, upon the polished surface of the desk, aligned parallel to its edge with an almost fastidious neatness. Beside it, a sheet of heavy cream paper bore the opening of a letter. Holmes approached the desk without haste. He did not immediately touch the key, but bent instead to study its position in relation to the inkwell and blotter. The letter read, "My dear Eleanor, I find myself on the threshold of a decision which must alter the course of my..." The key lies not merely in how she departed, but in why she intended to. As we withdrew from that curiously immaculate chamber, I could not dispel the sensation that the stillness we left behind was not the quiet of abandonment, but of concealment. And in the measured cadence of Holmes's footsteps along the corridor, I detected the unmistakable rhythm of a mind already assembling the invisible architecture of the crime. Chapter 2. Study in silence. Holmes commenced his formal examination of the chamber with the composure of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Whatever curiosity he had displayed upon first entering was now subdued into method. He removed his gloves, placed them neatly upon the mantel, and drew from his pocket that compact leather case, which contained his lens, measuring tape, and small chemical vials. His manner grew almost impersonal, as though the vanished heiress were already transformed into a problem of structure and sequence. The first duty, he observed, is to eliminate the impossible The remainder, however improbable, must then be considered with sobriety. The grate, though empty of flame, retained a shallow bed of grey ash from the previous evening's fire. Holmes crouched low, his long fingers delicately sifting through the residue. The ashes were compact, and even with no recent disturbance, not a flake had been displaced beyond the iron bars. No hurried departure by the chimney, he said quietly. Even had Miss Whitmore possessed the agility of a sweep's apprentice, she would have left some trace, dislodged soot, scattered ash, abrasion upon the brick. The flue remains untouched. You do not seriously entertain the possibility that she escaped by such means? I asked. Holmes's lips twitched faintly. I entertain all possibilities until they refute themselves. This one does so readily. He rose and proceeded once more to the windows. The tall sash frames were solid, their brass latches polished by regular care. He examined the fittings through his lens, scrutinizing the screws and the minute recesses where tool marks might hide. No scratches, he murmured. No recent abrasion. The oxidation upon these screws is undisturbed. If tampered with, the act was accomplished by one of supernatural delicacy. He pressed gently against the glass panes. They held firm. Then, with careful fingers, he lifted the lower sash an inch, observed the balance weights within the side channel, and lowered it again. Even if raised from without, he said, the counterweight would have betrayed some displacement, and there are no footprints in the flower beneath. We had already inspected the ground below from the garden path. The soil, softened by recent rain, preserved clearly the impressions of a gardener's boots from the afternoon, but none from the night. Holmes next turned his attention to the bed. Its coverlet lay smooth, its embroidered surface unmarred by crease or indentation save for the faint depression upon one pillow that I had earlier noted. She did not retire, he said decisively. Yet her uncle stated she went to her chamber at 10:30. She may have entered the room, Holmes replied, but she did not prepare for sleep. Observe the counterpane. No disturbance at the foot, where one would draw it aside. The sheets beneath are unwrinkled. Even the bolster remains symmetrically placed. He leaned closer to the pillow. The household, as Mr. Whitmore had indicated, comprised 3 immediate relations besides the missing lady. Mr. Edwin Whitmore himself, uncle and guardian, his son Arthur, and Mrs. Whitmore, whose delicate constitution kept her largely secluded. Beyond them were the necessary attendants of an affluent London house, housekeeper, butler, maids, and a gardener. Yet Holmes's attention, for the moment, fixed upon the family circle, for there the currents ran deepest. Mr. Edwin Whitmore received us again with an air of restrained grief. He had resumed his station by the fireplace, as though its steady warmth might lend steadiness to his mind. His features were composed, yet that composure seemed to me a cultivated thing, less the natural calm of a man unaccustomed to panic than the controlled effort of one determined not to lose command of circumstance. You have examined Clara's chamber, he said, voice firm. You find no clue. Holmes seated himself without invitation, his long fingers steepled before him. I find a great many clues, he replied, but I have not yet determined which are true and which have been planted to appear so. A faint tightening about Mr. Whitmore's mouth betrayed displeasure. Planted. Holmes's gaze remained mild. I have found, sir, that when a room presents itself as too perfect, it is often because imperfection has been removed. Mr. Whitmore inclined his head, as though accepting a philosophical point. Yet Holmes's eyes lingered upon him with that peculiar stillness that seemed to invite the subject to betray himself by over-control. Arthur Whitmore entered at that moment. Mr. Whitmore's son, a young man of perhaps 7 and 20, with handsome features that had begun already to show the strain of indulgence. His hair was carefully brushed, his waistcoat of good cut, his fingers bore signet rings of fashionable taste. Yet his eyes were reddened, not solely from sleeplessness, but from the nervous irritation of one accustomed to urgency in his pleasures, and now confronted by an urgency he could not manage. Have you found her? He demanded, hardly waiting to greet us. But perhaps you may assist me. Arthur flung himself into a chair opposite Holmes, and immediately rose again, as though unable to remain still. His gaze darted from his father to me and back. "You were close to your cousin?" Holmes asked. Arthur gave a short laugh, as close as one can be to a woman who thinks herself a moral reformer. Clara had decided she must improve the world. It made for tedious conversations at dinner. "And yet you are shaken." Arthur's lips tightened. "She is family, whatever our differences. He broke off, running a hand through his hair. "It is not natural. A locked room, gone without sound. It is absurd." "Absurdities," Holmes replied, "are often the cloak of design. Tell me of your cousin's disposition these past weeks." Arthur shrugged, but the gesture was too quick, too defensive. She had grown independent. Father had always indulged her, of course. She spoke of charities, reforms. She made herself busy. Did she speak of leaving this house? Arthur hesitated. Leaving number. Why should she? She has everything. Holmes's gaze sharpened. At this, Mr. Whitmore's eyes hardened. "Mr. Fenwick is in London this evening. He will be available." Holmes's voice remained courteous. "Excellent. He will be most valuable." Mrs. Whitmore had sunk onto a chaise, her face pale as paper. "Clara would never run away," she whispered. "She is not that sort of girl." Holmes's expression softened again, but his eyes remained keen. "Madam, women run from many things, some from fear, some from duty, some from knowledge. I must learn which, if any, applies." He rose, at last, and the family rose with him as though his movements compelled their own. "I would ask one further thing," Holmes said, turning to Mr. Whitmore. "Was there any quarrel last night? Any raised voices? Any unusual visitors?" Mr. Whitmore shook his head with deliberate calm. "Nothing." The house was quiet. Arthur's gaze flicked involuntarily toward his mother, then away. Holmes caught it. He said nothing, but I saw in his face the faint satisfaction of one who has observed an unguarded gesture. When we at last withdrew from the drawing room, Holmes walked beside me down the corridor, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed upon nothing visible. "They are not a harmonious trio," I remarked. Holmes's mouth tightened. "Family harmony, Watson, is often no more than rehearsed concord. Observe the pattern. The uncle's composure is too measured, the son's indignation too immediate, the wife's fragility too convenient. Yet none of these alone prove guilt. Then what do they prove?" "That Miss Whitmore's disappearance did not erupt suddenly," Holmes said quietly. "It matured among them, like mold in a dark cellar, slow, unseen, and nourishing itself upon secrecy." He paused at the foot of the stairs, and his voice dropped still lower. "The inheritance," he murmured, "is a lever. Someone has been pressing upon it, and when one presses too hard, something gives." Chapter 4, Fay the Half, written letter the room, for all its tidiness, possessed one object that stubbornly resisted the air of arrangement, the half-written letter upon the escritoire. It lay as if placed for inspection. Yet, when Holmes returned to it after his interviews with the Whitmores, his expression suggested not resignation but renewed interest, as though the paper were less a clue than a mind pressed flat into ink and fiber. We had asked that the chamber remain untouched, and the servants, cowed by Holmes's authority and their own superstitious dread of the locked room, obeyed with a reverence usually reserved for funerary rites. The key still lay in its precise alignment upon the desk. The pen still rested in its stand. The letter still waited like a sentence, interrupted mid-trial. Holmes drew the paper toward him with the tips of 2 fingers, as one might handle a specimen which could be spoiled by warmth. He did not read it at once. Instead, he held it to the window, turning it slightly so that the grey light slid across the surface. "You see, Watson," he said, "ink is honest in ways people are not. It reveals haste, hesitation, and intent. It betrays whether the hand trembled, whether the mind faltered, whether the heart surged." He produced his lens and measured the pen strokes at the letter's opening. The curve of the M in my, the firmness of the downstroke in dear, the deliberate shaping of the capital E in Eleanor. Each letter was well formed, with the poised confidence of an educated young woman. Yet as his eye traveled downward, the line thickened, the pressure increased. The writing begins evenly, Holmes observed, and grows firmer. She was not frightened at the outset. She was resolved, then more resolved. Conviction strengthened as she wrote. He tapped a place mid-paragraph. Here, the downstroke is heavier, that corresponds with the phrase she chose. She took courage in naming her purpose. I leaned closer as Holmes read aloud, for he had by now drawn the sheet fully free of the blotter and opened its careful fold. What had first appeared only as an opening and a broken sentence now revealed several measured paragraphs, restrained in tone and deliberate in intent. My dear Eleanor, I find myself on the threshold of a decision which must alter the course of my life. You have long been my confidante, and I trust you will not think me rash when I say that I have discovered something within these walls that compels me toward a necessary escape. Do not be alarmed for me. I am not threatened, but I am watched. It is a strange thing to feel eyes upon one, even in silence, not with malice, but with expectation, as though my very movements are accounted for before I make them. If I act quickly, it is not from panic but from prudence. There are matters here which I can no longer ignore, and though I would gladly confront them openly, I have come to see that openness would serve only to place me at a disadvantage. I beg you, therefore, to the final line ended in the familiar blot, as though the ink itself had swallowed her thought. Yet the tone of the letter, as Holmes had remarked, was not frantic. It read as preparation, an orderly arrangement of intent shaped to reassure and to instruct. The most striking element, Holmes said, is what is absent. Fear, I suggested. Precisely, there is no emotional flourish, no exclamation, no desperate appeal. This is not the work of a woman seized by sudden terror. It is the work of one who has contemplated her position, weighed options, and chosen a course. He ran his finger lightly across the paper's surface, careful not to smudge the ink. Observe also, he continued, the fold. I had not noticed it at first, yet when Holmes held the sheet at an angle, faint creases became visible. The paper had been folded once, carefully along its center, as though prepared for an envelope, then it had been reopened and flattened again, leaving the crease like a scar. She intended to send it, I said, and then reconsidered. Holmes replied, or perhaps she began to send it, then realized that posting it too soon would alert the very watchers she describes. He lifted the letter, peered along its edge, and placed it once more upon the blotter. Does the address tell us anything? I asked. It does, Holmes said. Eleanor resides in Surrey, Clara's cousin by the maternal line, and the sister of Henry Dalton, who keeps a quiet house near Dorking, not within this household. Therefore Clara's trust extended beyond these walls, and that suggests she suspected those within them. Holmes's eyes gleamed. It suggests she believed her danger. If danger it was, originated here. One does not write of being watched while surrounded by affection, unless one doubts that affection. He leaned closer to the ink blot itself. Under the lens, the stain was revealed not as a chaotic splatter, but as a concentrated pool, rounded at one edge and feathered slightly at the other, as though the nib had hovered, releasing ink without motions. She paused here, Holmes murmured. A pause long enough for ink to gather, then she set the pen down. Interrupted. Yes, but not by force. He rose and moved to the chair that had stood askew. He measured again its position relative to the desk. Then he returned to the letter and placed his finger upon a point just beneath the blot. Here, he said. Do you see this faint indentation? The paper was pressed by something firm, a finger perhaps, after the ink had dried. You mean someone touched it later? Holmes nodded. The impression is not of the pen. The ink would have smeared. It is of a hand that handled the letter after it had already been written. Then the letter may have been read, I said, or arranged. Holmes corrected. A letter may serve two purposes, communication and misdirection. He walked slowly to the window and stood with his back to the room, the letter held loosely at his side. The fog beyond the glass moved like pale smoke. The phrase, necessary escape, is curious, he said at last. Not flight, not runaway, Not rescue, but escape. It implies constraint. Yet she says she is not threatened. She is watched, not menaced. That is the language of someone under surveillance rather than pursuit. Surveillance by whom? I asked. Holmes turned his head slightly, eyes narrowed in thought. A guardian, a household, a solicitor, or someone who fears what she might do with her fortune once free. His fingers tapped the paper. She says openness would place her at a disadvantage. That implies she intended to investigate further, to gather proof. I remembered Arthur's bitter remark that Clara had grown suspicious of her uncle's administration of the estate. You think, I said, that she uncovered financial irregularity? Holmes inclined his head. It is one possibility, and if so, her disappearance may be the result of two opposing forces. Her own intention to escape, and another's intention to make that escape appear impossible. He held the letter up again and examined the reverse side. There were faint traces where the ink had bled through slightly. He ran his thumb along the margin. The paper is of good quality, he said. Purchased from a stationer in Bond Street, likely. Yet there is a smudge here, very slight. He sniffed the corner and his eyes sharpened. No, Holmes replied, and his voice grew suddenly quiet. Not lavender. He brought the corner closer to his nostrils again and inhaled carefully, as though tasting the air. A faint, bitter almond. No more than a trace, he murmured. A chill ran down my spine. As a physician, I knew too well what that scent might signify. Prussic acid, I whispered. Holmes's eyes did not leave the paper. A trace only, perhaps from some household preparation or perfume, ingredient that has brushed the paper. Not enough to harm, but enough to suggest danger to any mind inclined toward it. You think it was deliberately scented? I asked. I think, Holmes said, that someone wanted it to imply poison, or faintness, or danger, something dramatic enough to mislead an investigator. He placed the letter back upon the desk with reverent care. It is a curtain, he said quietly, drawn to obscure the stage beyond. How so? Holmes looked at me, his face composed, but his eyes bright with the cold thrill of deduction. Because it tells us just enough to satisfy the anxious mind, he replied. It suggests that Clara felt watched. It hints at escape. It breaks off at the moment of greatest import. It is incomplete in precisely the way a storyteller would choose, leaving us to imagine what she intended to beg, to warn, to reveal. And you think she left it that way on purpose? A woman writing in panic does not pause to fold her paper, then reopen it. A woman seized by violence does not set down her pen neatly. The absence of emotional flourish, the measured phrasing, the deliberate crease, all speak of design. He moved toward the door, and I followed, still glancing back at that pale sheet upon the desk, so ordinary and yet so charged. If the letter is a curtain, I said, what lies behind it? Holmes's hand rested upon the doorknob. The mechanism of the locked door, he replied, and the motive that required it. Clara intended an escape. Someone else intended a mystery. He opened the door, and the corridor's dimness swallowed the room behind us. Yet the sensation remained, like a hand upon the shoulder, that the letter, half written and half revealed, was not the cry of a victim, but the first move of a mind engaged in silent war within its own household. And Holmes, with his characteristic detachment, had already begun to see the shape of the conflict that the Whitmores wished to keep unseen. Chapter V. Fay the Misplaced Chair. Holmes returned to the chair as a chess player returns to a piece which, though modest in appearance, governs the whole board. It stood near the desk where Clara Whitmore had written her incomplete letter, an ordinary article of furniture, unremarkable to any servant who dusted it, and yet to Holmes it possessed the significance of a fingerprint left upon the mind. The easiest truths, he remarked, are those we are trained not to notice. We were again in Miss Whitmore's chamber. Evening had fallen, and the room was now lit by gas, the flame within the globe casting a honeyed circle upon the desk and leaving the corners in soft obscurity. The fog pressed faintly at the windows, like a living thing seeking entry. In that half-light, the neatness of the room seemed less innocent and more contrived, as if the shadows themselves suspected arrangement. Holmes drew the chair outward by an inch and paused, his eyes upon the carpet. "Observe, Watson." I knelt beside him. At first I saw only the patterned weave. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I perceived it, faint depressions in the pile, for shallow ovals where the chair's legs had rested longer than they had at present. The current placement left its own impressions, but these older marks lay slightly to the left and back, as though the chair had once been positioned squarely to the desk for use, and only later shifted to its present oblique angle. "It stood here," Holmes said, touching the older indentations with the tip of his finger, "for hours, perhaps days, enough to compress the fibers, and then he indicated the newer marks. It was moved, and moved carefully, as one lifts an object to avoid scuffing. To make it appear askew?" I asked. "Not merely askew," Holmes replied. "To make it appear casually disturbed, like the residue of interruption, a theatrical touch." He rose and looked toward the ceiling. The cornice was decorative, a modest Victorian flourish of plasterwork running along the upper edge of the walls. Nothing about it suggested a secret, yet Holmes's gaze held steady, and I recalled his earlier remark, that the chair might be used not to reach the ceiling but to alter perception. He placed the chair precisely over the older indentations and tested its stability. "Now," he said quietly, "let us see what Clara, or someone, could have seen." Holmes stepped onto the seat with the balance of a man accustomed to improbable perches. From that elevation, his head was near the cornice, and the gaslight illuminated the upper molding at a shallow angle. "Hand me the lens," he said. I passed it up. He held it close to the plaster, moving slowly along the line where wall met ceiling. For a time he found nothing. Then his posture changed subtly but unmistakably. His shoulders stiffened, and his head angled as a bird's does when it sights a worm beneath grass. "Aha," he murmured. "What is it?" "A seam," Holmes replied, and his voice held that restrained satisfaction which, in him, replaced any vulgar exclamation. He stepped down and drew the chair a fraction to the right. "Stand here, Watson, on the floor, and look where I indicate. Do you see anything peculiar?" I stared at the cornice where his finger pointed. I saw plaster scrollwork, a faint shadow, perhaps a slight irregularity, too subtle to name. "Nothing distinct," I admitted. "Exactly," Holmes said. "It is designed not to be distinct. Now mount the chair." I did so carefully, feeling at once the odd intimacy of being raised into the architecture's secrets. From that height, the surface resolved itself. What had seemed mere ornament was interrupted by a narrow rectangular outline, so thin that it merged with the surrounding pattern, yet undeniable when seen close. At its center lay a minute grill of perforated metal, painted the same cream color as the plaster. "A ventilation grate," I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied below, "and not part of any modern arrangement. Such grates were common in older constructions, when the fear of miasma led builders to invent ingenious channels for air. Most were sealed or forgotten when gas and later improvements altered circulation." He climbed back onto the chair beside me with ease, and together we inspected the small grill. Its size was scarcely larger than a man's hand. It appeared fixed and undisturbed, until Holmes angled the lens toward the tiny screws at its corners. "There," he said softly. The screw heads, though painted over, bore minute crescents where metal had been exposed. It was the unmistakable sign of recent turning. Paint fractured, edges bright beneath. "It has been unscrewed," I whispered. "And carefully replaced," Holmes said. "Note the paint, disturbed just enough to reveal movement, then touched up in haste. A careless hand would have left flecks. A skilled hand leaves only what the light betrays." He produced a small screwdriver from his case and tested the upper screw. It yielded at once, and as it turned, the paint flaked slightly, confirming that it had not been sealed for years. Holmes removed each screw with methodical care, catching them in his palm. Then he lifted the grill away. Behind it lay a dark opening, narrow but deeper than I expected. A faint current of air breathed out, carrying a smell not of lavender and polished wood, but of dust, old lime, and something stale like long shut linen. Holmes leaned forward, peering into the aperture. "Is it a duct?" I asked. "It is an entrance," Holmes replied. He withdrew, his eyes bright now with quiet triumph. He reached into his pocket and took out a small taper and matches. With the taper lit, he held its flame near the opening. The flame bent inward at once, drawn by a draught. "A passage," he said, "and one with air enough to sustain a candle. But Holmes, surely not a passage for a person. It is far too small." "Too small for an adult," Holmes agreed. "Not necessarily too small for a slight young woman, if the opening continues beyond this narrow point." He passed the candle closer, and I saw the duct widen slightly beyond the first span. The inner edges were smooth, not jagged. Someone had padded it, perhaps, or the masonry itself had been cut with deliberation long ago. Holmes slid his hand inside to the wrist, feeling along the inner lip. Then he withdrew it and showed me his fingertips. They were grey with soot, like dust, but among it was a faint streak of something lighter. "Chalk," he said. "Fresh. Someone has marked their way. Marked. Within the passage." He nodded. "A guide for the hand, or the knee, or the foot. If one crawls," he stepped down, his face now more animated than at any moment since our arrival. With swift movements, he secured a length of cord to the chair back, and then to the desk, an improvised safety measure should the chair shift while one was partially within the opening. "Watson," he said, "I shall require your medical impartiality and your sturdy patience. The architecture wishes to swallow its secret, and we must enter it without becoming its victims." Before I could protest, Holmes set the chair firmly, mounted it again, and slipped his shoulders into the opening with astonishing dexterity. For a moment he hung there, half vanished, his boots balanced upon the chair seat. Then, with a controlled wriggle, he drew himself inside until only his legs remained. His voice, muffled by plaster, came back to me. "It widens, immediately beyond the lip, a crawl space, lined with boards. Someone has reinforced it." I held the taper aloft beneath him. The flame flickered, then steadied. "Do you see anything?" I asked. A cross, beam, then a turn. There are handprints in dust, and his voice paused. A rope fastened above. He drew himself backward, emerging with a light film of grey upon his sleeves, and landed upon the chair as lightly as a cat. "It is not merely a duct," he said. "It is a concealed route. A servant's passage of the older sort, one of those architectural compromises by which great houses permitted invisible movement. A maid could traverse from corridor to corridor without appearing, or a footman could carry coal and trays without disturbing the family's privacy. But why is it here, opening into a young lady's room?" Holmes's gaze rested upon the cornice. "Because the house is older than Miss Whitmore's occupancy. Rooms change purpose. What was once a servant's anteroom may now be a bedchamber, and such passages, if not demolished, become ghosts in the walls." He replaced the grille loosely, not yet, securing it, and descended. "Now," he said, "we must discover where this route leads." He left the room with quick, decisive steps, and I followed. Down the corridor he went, pausing occasionally to examine the moldings above doorways, the corners where plaster met wood, the subtle irregularities which might conceal similar grilles. Once he stopped before a blank stretch of wall and tapped it lightly. The sound differed, hollow rather than solid. "Here," he murmured. "The passage runs behind this." We descended a narrower staircase toward the rear of the house, where the carpet gave way to plain wood and the air grew cooler. The sounds of family life faded, replaced by the muted clink of kitchen, implements, and the distant murmur of servants. Holmes entered the back corridor and stood still, eyes half-lidded, as though listening not to noise, but to structure. At last he approached a door that seemed no different from any other, painted white, fitted with a plain brass knob. "What lies beyond?" he asked a passing maid. The girl startled and curtsied, That, sir? It's a store cupboard. We hardly use it. Open it. She hesitated, glanced toward the kitchen, and obeyed. The cupboard was narrow and dim, smelling of old polish and damp. Shelves lined the walls, holding folded linens and a few tarnished candlesticks. Yet Holmes's attention fixed not on these, but on the back panel, where the wall appeared oddly thick. He knelt, ran his fingers along the baseboard, and found what he sought, a seam concealed beneath paint and dust. He pressed, and a section of panel shifted inward with a faint click. The maid gasped. "I never knew." "Few do," Holmes replied. He swung the concealed panel open. A narrow space lay beyond, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. It descended in darkness. Holmes took the maid's candle, held it out, and peered down. "A servant's passage indeed," he said. I felt my pulse quicken. The idea that the house possessed hidden arteries, silent corridors within its flesh, lent a new and sinister logic to Clara's disappearance. She had not vanished into thin air. She had stepped into architecture, swallowed by the very walls. Holmes stepped into the opening, his shoulders brushing the sides. I followed, my medical curiosity overcoming discomfort. The passage descended by rough steps and then leveled into a low corridor. The air was close. Thick with dust, cobwebs hung like old lace from ceiling beams. The walls were brick, the mortar cracked with age. Holmes held the candle low, scanning the floor. There, upon the dust, were marks. Faint, but unmistakable. The drag of fabric, the impression of a shoe, the scuff where someone's knee had pressed. "Recent," he said. "Within the last 24 hours. "And chalk," I added, recalling his fingertips. Holmes nodded. Along the left wall, at waist height, were small pale streaks, subtle guides, as if someone had drawn a line for their hand in darkness. One ensures that in the moment of necessity, movement is swift and silent. We advanced slowly, bent almost double, where the ceiling dipped. The passage ran straight for perhaps 20 yards, then turned sharply. Holmes paused at each junction, noting the pattern of dust, the direction of scuffs. At one point he held the candle near a beam and examined a fresh scratch in the wood. "A rope was secured here," he said. "To assist climbing, the rope has been removed, but the fibers remain." He bent and picked up something from the floor, a small fragment of green thread. "From upholstery," I suggested. He held it to the light. "From the chair's damask," he replied. "It caught upon a rough edge as someone climbed. That confirms the chair's use." The passage narrowed again, and then, abruptly, ended at a stout wooden door bolted from this side. Holmes ran his hand along it, then tested the bolt. It was stiff with age, but not immovable. He drew it back, and the door creaked open upon hinges that had not turned in years. Beyond lay a small brick chamber, a kind of dead-end room filled with discarded boards, broken baskets, and the debris of neglect. A wooden hatch in the floor was visible beneath the rubbish, its iron ring half buried. Holmes moved the boards aside with quick efficiency. He seized the ring and tugged. The hatch lifted, releasing a breath of colder air from below. A narrow shaft descended into deeper darkness. "Down to the cellars," I asked, "or to a lower servants' corridor?" Holmes replied. He lowered the candle and watched the flame. It guttered, then steadied again. "There is air," he said. "Therefore the route continues." But his eyes narrowed. "Something is wrong." "What?" He descended one step, then another, feeling with his foot. After a moment he halted and withdrew. "The lower end has been sealed," he said. "Sealed," he pointed. The shaft's lower portion had been blocked by a crude wall of brick and mortar, old, perhaps decades old. Yet at its base the mortar was cracked, and the bricks bore marks where someone had recently struck them. "They attempted to break through," Holmes said, "but not recently enough to succeed last night. Or perhaps they did not need to." He stood still, candlelight flickering upon his face, and for a moment his triumph cooled into calculation. "This passage," he said quietly, "has not been used for years. Until now, someone reopened it from above, chalked it, rehearsed it, and made it functional. But the lower outlet remains blocked. Therefore, whoever used it last night did not intend to exit by that route. Then why enter it at all? Holmes's eyes gleamed again, but now with a sharper edge, because the passage does not need to be an escape route. It may be a hiding place, or a means of movement between two upper points, one of which we have not yet discovered. He turned back the way we had come, his mind already running ahead like a hound, scenting a trail. When we emerged into the cupboard once more, the maid stood trembling, her eyes wide. "Sir," she whispered, "does that mean Miss Clara was taken through there?" Holmes's voice softened slightly. "It means, my girl, that Miss Clara did not evaporate. She was moved, by her own will or by another's, and the house itself assisted." We returned to the chamber above. Holmes climbed the chair once more and replaced the ventilation grate. This time he tightened the screws exactly as he had found them, leaving the smallest fracture of paint undisturbed. He stepped down and looked about the room anew. The locked door, the key upon the desk, the tidy bed, all now appeared less like impossibilities and more like elements of a carefully designed illusion. The locked room had been a magician's box, the secret passage, the hidden trapdoor beneath the stage. Someone wanted us to believe she vanished from here into nowhere, Holmes said. Instead, she stepped into the wall. To hide, I asked, or to be hidden? Holmes's gaze rested once more upon the half-written letter. Both possibilities remain, he replied. But consider, the passage required preparation, chalk, marks, rope, loosening screws. That is not spontaneous. That is meticulous rehearsal. Therefore, whether Clara used it willingly or was forced, the plan existed before last night. He walked to the desk and lifted the key again, weighing it as he had done before. "The stage is set," he murmured. "The props are arranged, the actors have learned their cues, and somewhere behind the curtain, the true drama proceeds." He replaced the key and turned toward me, his eyes bright with that peculiar, cold excitement which meant that the hunt had become real. "Watson," he said, "we have discovered the mechanism. Now we must discover the motive, and the hand that practiced it." As he spoke, a sound drifted faintly up from the house below, the subdued murmur of voices in the drawing room, the gentle clink of china. Ordinary life continuing, oblivious to the secret corridors in its walls. Yet to me, after what we had seen, the house no longer seemed a safe monument of domestic respectability. It seemed an organism capable of concealment, capable of swallowing truth. And Clara Whitmore, wherever she lay within its hidden veins, had not vanished into thin air. She had vanished into design. Chapter VC Debts and Decisions. Holmes has often been accused, by those who mistake his detachment for coldness, of caring only for puzzles and not for people. Yet I have observed time and again that his truest interest lies precisely where human motive and mechanical contrivance intersect. A locked room may delight his intellect, but a locked life will stir something sterner within him. Miss Clara Whitmore's disappearance, with its calculated stillness and hidden architecture, belonged unmistakably to the latter category. The next morning broke with a pallid autumnal light, the fog over Hampstead thinning into a damp grey that clung to brick and leaf. Holmes rose early, ate nothing, and by 9 o'clock had set his mind upon what he termed the financial anatomy of the household. It was a phrase that made me smile at the time before the day was done. It made me uneasy. We began with Arthur Whitmore. Holmes did not question him again in the house. He preferred to study a man in the environment that nourished his weaknesses. Thus we took a hansom to St. James's, and there, by that curious method of unobtrusive inquiry which he practiced like an art, Holmes learned in an hour what a direct interrogation might never have revealed. Arthur Whitmore was known at several London clubs, frequented discreet gaming rooms off Pall Mall, and was not, as his clothing suggested, a young man of unlimited means. A quiet word with a club porter, a visit to a discreet publican, a glance at a ledger kept by a tradesman of Bond Street, and Holmes had assembled a portrait more accurate than Arthur's own self-image. "He has been borrowing against expectation," Holmes remarked, as we walked along a wet pavement, the city's carriage wheels hissing in puddles. And expectation, Watson, is a dangerous collateral. It is the gambler's arithmetic. One stakes tomorrow to pay for today. Is it serious? I asked. Holmes produced a small notebook. Consider the facts. In the last 6 months he has ordered clothing beyond his allowance, pawned a watch of decent make, and acquired a ring of second-hand setting. He has, moreover, been seen leaving a moneylender's office in Holborn on 3 occasions. Then his agitation last night was explained, I said. Partially explained, Holmes corrected. A man in debt is agitated by any mention of money, even when the mention is innocent. But debt does not alone make a man a kidnapper. It makes him reckless, not patient. We reached a narrow street where a brass plate glinted dully upon a door. Mr. Silas Grent, financial agent. Holmes rapped once. A clerk admitted us into a cramped room, smelling of ink and stale tobacco. Behind a desk sat a thin man with sharp eyes. Mr. Grent himself, one of those predators who survive by feeding upon the desperation of gentlemen. He looked Holmes up and down with suspicion. "If you've come to threaten me, sir." "I have come," Holmes replied pleasantly, "to ask whether Mr. Arthur Whitmore has honored his obligations." Grent snorted. "He honors them as a man honors the dawn. By pretending it is farther away than it is, he pays when pressed. He borrows again when released." "How much does he owe?" Grant's eyes narrowed. "That is confidential." Holmes smiled, and there was something in that smile that made even Grant shift uneasily. "Confidentiality is a fine word, Mr. Grant, but it is not a shield against truth. You will tell me the figure, because if you do not, I shall make inquiry elsewhere, perhaps at the magistrate's office where your methods are less appreciated." Grant hesitated, then relented with ill grace. 3,000, near enough, and that's only to me." Holmes nodded, as though ticking off an item on a list. "And you have visited Hampstead?" Grant's eyes flicked. "I do not harass my clients at home." "You have visited," Holmes repeated. A faint flush appeared on Grant's sallow cheeks. "Once. My clerk went twice." Holmes leaned forward. "On what dates?" "Last Thursday, and the week before. We sent a note." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A note delivered within the household?" "Yes." "And did Miss Clara Whitmore ever see it?" Grant blinked. "How should I know?" Holmes stood. "Because if she did, Mr. Grant, it may have altered the course of her life." We left Grant behind, spluttering. Outside, Holmes paused beneath a dripping awning and made a brief note. "You think Clara intercepted a creditor's warning?" I asked. "I think she learned more than her family intended," Holmes replied. "And that knowledge may have contributed to her decision." His mind, however, did not linger upon Arthur. We went next to Lincoln's Inn, where Mr. Harold Fenwick maintained chambers. Holmes had sent a message earlier, and now was received with hurried civility. Fenwick was a man of perhaps 40, with careful hair, careful cuffs, and the careful manner of one who believes caution to be a virtue in itself. Yet his eyes behind wire spectacles were quick and restless. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "this is most distressing, Miss Whitmore." "Gone, spare me the adjectives," Holmes replied. "Tell me what you know." Fenwick swallowed and gestured us into his inner office. "Miss Whitmore consulted me last week regarding her inheritance. She wished to understand precisely what powers she would gain at her majority. And why did she wish that?" Holmes asked. Fenwick hesitated. "She expressed concerns about the management." Holmes's gaze was steady. "About Mr. Edwin Whitmore?" Fenwick's fingers twitched upon his blotter. "She did not accuse directly, but she asked pointed questions. She wished to inspect certain accounts." "And did you permit it?" "I advised caution. She is young. Financial matters can be complex." Holmes's voice sharpened. "Complexity is often the refuge of dishonesty. Did you show her the papers or not?" Fenwick's face grew pale. "I showed her summaries." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Summaries prepared by whom?" Fenwick's voice dropped. "By Mr. Whitmore's agent." Holmes leaned back, expression unreadable. "So she received filtered truth." Fenwick wiped his brow. "Mr. Holmes, you must understand. Sir Julian's will included certain protective structures. Clara was not to interfere before 25, and yet she will be 25 next month. Yes, Fenwick admitted. Holmes's gaze grew intent. Did she speak to you of marriage? Fenwick's eyes flickered. There was discussion of a proposal, favored by Mr. Whitmore. Fenwick hesitated again, then nodded. Mr. Whitmore believed it prudent. He suggested a match with Mr. Percival Hargreaves. Hargreaves, I repeated. The name meant little to me, a distant connection. Fenwick explained quickly. A man of respectable standing, a partner in certain industrial ventures. And what would such a marriage accomplish? Fenwick clasped his hands. It would consolidate matters. Under the settlement, portions of the estate would be managed jointly. Clara's husband would assume certain responsibilities, and Mr. Whitmore's oversight would continue during the transition. In other words, Holmes said quietly, her independence would be postponed under a new banner. Fenwick looked away. And did Miss Whitmore accept this arrangement? Holmes asked. No, Fenwick said, voice strained. She refused. She said she would not be. He searched for the phrase. Managed into matrimony. Those were her words. Holmes nodded slowly, as though hearing in that phrase the echo of Clara's letter. She asked me, Fenwick continued, whether she might alter the trusteeship at 25, whether she could dismiss her uncle's agent, whether she could take control at once. And you told her? Fenwick's hands tightened. That yes, at 25, she would possess full power, but I warned her that confrontation might create unpleasantness within the family. Holmes stood abruptly. And did she mention to you any plan of escape? Fenwick blinked. Escape? Number, she spoke only of caution. She said she must obtain proof before she acted. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Proof of what? Fenwick swallowed. She did not say. We left Fenwick's chambers with more answers than comfort. In the street outside, Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, his mind working with that fierce inward energy I had come to recognize. At last he spoke. The tensions in that house are real, he said. Arthur's debts, Edwin's desire to retain control, the proposed marriage all provide motive, yet motive is not mechanism. And the mechanism, I said, is the secret passage. Precisely, and the use of that passage last night required rehearsal, chalk, and careful unscrewing of the grate. Does that sound like Arthur? I pictured Arthur's restless hands, his quick anger, his clumsy indignation. Number, does it sound like Edwin? Holmes continued. Edwin's composure, his calculated calm came to mind. He had patience. But did he possess the daring to crawl through a dusty servant's passage and stage an immaculate chamber? He might, I admitted. He seems deliberate. Holmes shook his head. Deliberate men rarely risk physical discomfort when they can employ others. And if Edwin were the architect, he would have sealed the passage afterward more thoroughly. He would have ensured no chalk marks remained. He would have burned the letter rather than leave it as a curtain. You believe Clara left it herself? Holmes's eyes gleamed. I do, I frowned. Then you think she orchestrated her own disappearance. Yet why? If she wished simply to leave, she could have walked out the front door. Holmes's pace slowed. Could she, a young woman of fortune watched within her own house, guardianship contested, marriage maneuvered? Do you imagine she could leave openly without causing immediate alarm and pursuit? She might have taken a cab and been followed. Holmes cut in, or stopped, or questioned. No, Watson, if she wished to act freely, she required time. Time to gather proof, time to reach a confidante, time to ensure that when she struck decisively. We reached a corner where the fog pooled thickest, and Holmes paused beneath a street lamp. The cage, he observed softly, was visible long before the bird resolved to leave it. His words carried a strange tenderness, rare in him, as though he felt in Clara Whitmore's calculated act the echo of a mind forced into strategy by circumstance. But what of danger? I asked. If she has hidden herself in the house's secret passages, she may be trapped. Or if she has fled beyond, she may be vulnerable. Holmes's expression tightened. She is in danger, Watson, not necessarily because someone has seized her, though that remains possible, but because any plan involving secrecy depends upon one thing, that those who benefit from her silence do not discover where she has gone. He resumed walking, his stride quickening again. And now, with the knowledge of Arthur's debts and Edwin's maneuvers, we see the true structure. The family's tensions, real as they are, serve as camouflage. They distract. They persuade the mind toward the easy conclusion: abduction, murder, greed. And you dismiss those. Holmes's gaze was sharp. I dismiss abduction by family hand. Yes, not because they are virtuous, but because they are inelegant. The disappearance is elegant. It is patient. It is rehearsed. That is not Arthur, and it is too risky for Edwin to execute personally. Then who? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Either Clara herself, he replied, or someone who understands Clara so well that he could stage her intent. He did not speak again until we reached our lodgings. There, standing before the fire, he took from his pocket the fragment of green upholstery thread he had found in the passage and held it between finger and thumb. A thread, he murmured, from a chair that was moved to reach a grate that opened into forgotten architecture, and a letter that was folded, reopened, and left as a curtain. He looked at me, and in his gaze was not triumph, but urgency. We are not hunting a brute, he said. We are hunting a mind, and minds, Watson, are most dangerous when they believe themselves justified. Chapter 7. The hidden passage. If there was one quality in Mr. Edwin Whitmore that distinguished him above many men of his class, it was his instinct for control. He controlled his household through habit and propriety, his son through allowances and reproaches, his wife through gentleness and confinement. And now, faced with Holmes, he attempted, by composure, by measured speech, by the authority of ownership, to control the investigation as well. Holmes, however, had never been impressed by the title of guardian, nor by the illusion that a man may command truth as he commands servants. When he requested access to the old servant corridors below the house, Mr. Whitmore stiffened as if Holmes had proposed to disinter a corpse in the drawing room. I cannot permit strangers to rummage through my cellars, he said coldly. The place is unsafe, old passages, blocked ways. Holmes's voice was polite, almost gentle. Then, sir, we shall instead permit rumors to rummage through your reputation. It is remarkable how quickly London imagines the worst when a young heiress disappears from a locked room. Mr. Whitmore's lips compressed. You threaten me. I warn you, Holmes corrected. Your niece's life, or liberty, may depend upon ours. You may preserve your dignity at the cost of her safety, or surrender your dignity and perhaps recover her. Arthur, hovering near the door like a restless shadow, burst in. Father, for God's sake, let him, if Clara's alive down there. Mrs. Whitmore gave a soft cry and clutched her shawl. The fear in her eyes seemed genuine, but Holmes, in his quiet way, watched even her fear for signs of arrangement. At last Mr. Whitmore exhaled, as though conceding to an indignity that could not be avoided. Very well, but I insist my butler accompany you. And you will not, he swallowed, disturb anything unnecessarily. Holmes inclined his head. I disturb only what has already been disturbed. Within half an hour we were in the rear portions of the house, beyond the warmth of polished corridors. The butler, a stout man named Pritchard, carried a lantern and muttered constantly about rats. A maid followed reluctantly with a basket of candles. Holmes walked ahead, his coat brushed already with dust, his eyes bright with that peculiar concentration which turned gloom into a map. We entered the old store cupboard and slid aside the concealed panel. Cold air breathed out like the exhalation of a crypt. The servants shrank back. Holmes stepped in without hesitation. Come, Watson, he said. We have traced the vein. Now we must find where it opens. The passage was as I remembered, brick, lined, low, ceilinged, heavy with dust and cobwebs. The lantern light made the grime glitter in faint specks. Our boots left clear prints upon the floor, and Holmes immediately frowned. Pritchard, he said, walk behind us and keep to the right wall. Your footprints will otherwise obliterate what we seek." The butler bristled, but obeyed. Holmes advanced in silence, pausing frequently to examine the floor, the beams, the mortar. He stooped at one corner and held his lantern low. "Here," he murmured. "Do you see these impressions?" I knelt beside him. In the grime were faint marks, light steps close together, as if someone had moved cautiously, placing each foot with care. They were not the heavy prints of a man in boots. They were smaller, narrower, shaped for a slippered foot or a thin-soled shoe. "She came through here," I said. Holmes nodded. "And observe." He ran his finger along the dust beyond the prints. "Summonet has brushed the surface." Indeed, the grime in places had been swept in long, careful strokes, blurring the impressions but not removing them. It was as if the traveler had attempted to erase their own passage without making the erasure obvious. "A mind that anticipates pursuit," Holmes observed quietly, "and has time enough to tidy after itself." We moved onward. At the turn where the ceiling dipped, Holmes halted and raised his lantern to a wooden beam. A splinter protruded, and upon it clung a tiny fragment of fabric, caught like a flag upon a thorn. Holmes plucked it gently and held it to the light. A thread of fine wool, deep in color, dark, but with a muted richness. "The hue of Miss Whitmore's evening shawl," Holmes said. "How can you be sure?" I asked. He glanced at me. "Because Mrs. Whitmore described it to the maid this morning. A claret, colored wrap embroidered with a narrow black border. This fragment bears the same dye and the faint sheen of embroidery thread." The butler shifted nervously. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Miss Clara would never crawl through this filth." Holmes' gaze did not leave the fabric. "Do not mistake refinement for fragility, Pritchard. A woman who wishes freedom will crawl through worse than dust." We reached the end chamber, where yesterday we had found the blocked shaft. Holmes moved at once to the hatch and lifted it again. The crude wall of brick below remained. Yet Holmes's eyes narrowed as he studied the mortar. "It has been touched," he murmured. "Touched," I repeated. He leaned down, lantern illuminating the bricks. One corner bore a fine crack where the mortar had crumbled slightly. He inserted his knife blade and pried. A fragment broke loose easily. "This was not so yesterday," he said. "The mortar has been loosened, not by age, by deliberate chipping." The butler stared. "But it was sealed." Holmes smiled faintly. "Sealed from your knowledge, perhaps, but not from the knowledge of the one who practiced here." He knelt, set the lantern down, and with careful hands began to remove bricks. Not violently, but patiently, one loosened piece at a time. The wall, which had seemed stout, yielded more readily than I would have expected, as though its builder had intended it to appear permanent, while remaining removable by an informed hand. After several minutes, a gap opened, wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Cold air rushed up, bending the candle flame sharply. Holmes held his lantern into the opening. "There," he said. "The passage continues." He did not crawl through at once. Instead, he examined the edges of the removed bricks and the floor beneath. "Look," he said. On the lower dust lay the same light footprints. Then, several feet beyond, a broad swath where the grime had been brushed aside. "She descended," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and then she concealed her trail. We followed him down. The shaft led to a narrower tunnel, even older than the first, its brickwork more primitive, its air colder. It slanted gently upward, suggesting a route that rose toward the outside. The ceiling was low, forcing us to stoop. Cobwebs clung to our hair. The servants cursed softly behind us, their lanterns shaking. Holmes moved like a man who had entered the bloodstream of the house and now listened to its pulse. He paused at intervals to mark directions, murmuring measurements under his breath. "This route," he said once, "was never meant for gentlemen. It was meant for invisibility." At last the tunnel ended at a wooden door reinforced with iron bands. It was bolted, but Holmes smiled when he saw the bolt's position. "Unfastened recently," he said. "The dust is disturbed." He drew back the bolt. The door opened with surprising ease. Beyond lay a small recess beneath the house's rear wing, cluttered with old gardening implements. A staircase, narrow, steep, and forgotten, rose into darkness. Holmes ascended first. We emerged into a cramped shed-like structure built against the outer wall, its interior filled with coal sacks and tools. A faint crack of daylight showed at the edge of a side door. Holmes approached and tested the latch. It yielded without resistance. He opened it a fraction, and a breath of damp air swept in. Outside, we stood not at the main entrance, but at a narrow side passage flanked by a high brick wall. It led to an iron gate half, hidden by ivy. Beyond the gate lay the heath, its grey expanse stretching away into mist. From this angle, the gate could not be seen from the front of the house. One might slip through it without any servant at the main door, noticing more than a shadow in the fog. Holmes stepped into the passage and studied the ground. The soil was damp, but here, in the sheltered strip between wall and hedge, the earth was firm enough to hold only faint impressions. He crouched. "Footprints," he said. I bent beside him. There they were, small, light steps close together, and near them, fainter still, the sweeping marks of a brush. "She erased her trail again," I murmured. Holmes nodded, and chose her terrain wisely. The gate opens toward the heath, where fog and grass swallow evidence. A man watching the front of the house would see nothing. A servant in the corridor would hear nothing. He rose and looked out across the heath. The mist rolled low, and distant figures moved like ghosts. Somewhere out there lay paths leading to Hampstead village, to the railway, to the great arteries of London. "The route requires practice," I said. "It does," Holmes replied. "To traverse it swiftly and silently, through the grate, along the passage, down the shaft, through the shed, out the gate, one would need rehearsal." He turned back toward the house, and in his face I saw not merely triumph, but an almost grim admiration. "It becomes evident," he said, "that Miss Whitmore prepared this escape over time. She studied the house as though mapping a labyrinth." The servants hovered behind us, shocked, whispering. Mr. Whitmore had followed as far as the cupboard, but refused to descend, waiting above like a man unwilling to enter his own secrets. Now Holmes beckoned him forward. "You see, Mr. Whitmore," Holmes said, when the uncle reached the side passage, "the locked door above was not a prison, it was a decoy." Mr. Whitmore's face was pale. "You mean she left of her own accord?" "It is the leading probability," Holmes replied. "But the question remains, did she leave to free herself, or was she guided by another's plan?" Arthur stared out into the fog. "Clara, alone on the heath. She could be anywhere." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Not anywhere. A person who rehearses an escape does not wander without destination." He stepped through the gate, looked up and down the heath, side path, then returned. "The performance," Holmes said quietly, "had been perfected before its opening night." And as he spoke, I felt the strange shift in the case. The locked room had been solved, the passage revealed, the route traced. Yet the heart of the mystery, why Clara vanished, and what she meant to do once free, had only grown more urgent, for the discovery of such meticulous preparation implied not a whim, but a conflict long nurtured in silence. The bird had indeed left the cage, but the world beyond cages is not always kind. Chapter the 8th Fay, the Surrey Connection. The revelation of the hidden route to the heath might have satisfied an inspector who measured success by mechanism alone. It did not satisfy Holmes. To him, the passage was merely the throat by which the house had swallowed its secret. The true question was what the secret had become once it passed beyond the gate. "A woman who rehearses an escape," he remarked as we drove back toward Baker Street through damp London streets, "does not flee into fog without a plan. She flees toward a person, a paper, or a promise." His mind returned repeatedly to the half-written letter addressed to Eleanor in Surrey, and to the steady, preparatory tone in which Clara had spoken of being watched. The address was not a romantic fancy, but a chosen line of trust. If Clara had reached safety anywhere, Holmes reasoned, it would be under the roof of someone not entangled in the Whitmore household's daily tensions, someone who could offer shelter without immediately telegraphing it to Edwin Whitmore's circle. The following morning, Holmes made what he called discreet arrangements, by which he meant that he sent a message to the railway clerk. He had once assisted in a theft case, borrowed a plain traveling coat from a pawnbroker friend to obscure his silhouette, and insisted that I shave my moustache's edges so as to look less recognizable as a military physician and more like a worried uncle. I obeyed, though I confess it offended my vanity. We departed from Waterloo under a thin drizzle. The train clattered through the outskirts of London, passing sooty chimneys and rows of wet brick, then slipped gradually into the softened greens and browns of the countryside. Surrey, in autumn, wore a quieter melancholy than the city's fog. Hedgerows dark with rain, fields flattened by wind, and woods where the leaves fell with a tired rustle. Holmes sat opposite me in the compartment, eyes half closed. But I knew he was not resting. His mind ran over the same few facts like a needle over a record. Clara's steady handwriting, the folded and reopened page, the phrase "necessary escape," the chalked passage, the side gate to the heath. Each detail clicked into place with his unyielding precision. "Eleanor Whitmore, Dalton," he murmured at last. "Her name appears in Sir Julian Whitmore's correspondence, Clara's cousin by the maternal line. She resides near Dorking with her brother. Henry Dalton, quiet house, no clubs, no London indulgence, exactly the sort of refuge Clara would choose if she wanted shelter without gossip." "You are certain?" I asked. "Certain enough to act," Holmes replied. "Not certain enough to announce ourselves as detectives and cause a second flight." We arrived in a small station surrounded by damp embankments. A pony cart and 2 carriages waited in the yard. Holmes chose neither. Instead, we walked along a narrow lane bordered by thorn hedges, our boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. After a mile, we reached a modest country house of pale stone, its windows curtained, its garden kept but not ostentatious, an abode of comfortable discretion. Holmes rapped upon the door. After a pause, it opened to reveal a maid with reddened hands and cautious eyes. Holmes spoke softly, presenting himself not as the famous consulting detective, but as Mr. Sheridan, a friend of the family who had come with urgent news. It was a small deception, and a necessary one. The maid hesitated, then admitted us. We were led into a sitting room, warmed by a coal fire. Books lined the walls, a piano stood shut. The air smelled faintly of tea leaves and beeswax. Everything suggested quiet respectability, yet Holmes's gaze moved immediately, not to the furniture, but to the details. The placement of objects, the traces of life that contradicted the story a house wished to tell. A man entered, Mr. Henry Dalton, Eleanor Dalton's brother. He was of perhaps 35, with a scholar's stoop and a nervous, intelligent face. His hair was brushed too carefully, as though he had run a comb through it several times in agitation. His eyes, when they fell upon Holmes, widened with something that might have been fear or calculation. "Gentlemen," he said, "may I ask, who are you?" Holmes gave a slight bow. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We have come concerning Miss Clara Whitmore." For a moment Dalton's face drained of color. Then, with visible effort, he adopted an expression of polite incomprehension. "Miss Whitmore," he repeated. "I have not seen Miss Whitmore in years." Holmes nodded, as though accepting the denial as a social gesture rather than a fact. He sat without invitation and warmed his hands lightly at the fire. "I have always admired Surrey hospitality," he said pleasantly. "One may always depend upon it to offer tea, even to unexpected visitors." Dalton stiffened. "Tea." Holmes's eyes drifted to a side table. Upon it stood a tray, a teapot, 2 teaspoons, 2 cups, one of which bore a faint ring of moisture at its base, still glistening, as though recently set down. Holmes's voice remained mild. "It appears your hospitality has been practiced quite recently." Dalton's gaze flicked to the tray, then back. My housekeeper took tea earlier." Holmes's eyes moved again, and now I followed them. Behind a folding screen near the window, something dark hung in careless drape, too soft for a curtain, too refined for a servant's apron. Holmes rose and walked toward it. Dalton half rose as well, as if to stop him, then checked himself. Holmes drew the screen aside. A shawl lay there, claret-colored wool, embroidered with a narrow black border. "The same," Holmes said quietly. Dalton's shoulders sagged, the denial collapsed like a tent whose pole has been removed. "Very well," he said hoarsely. "Yes, she is here. And she arrived recently," Holmes observed. "The night before last," Dalton admitted. "Near midnight. She came by footpath from the station. She was exhausted, mud on her hem, her hands cold. She begged me to take her in." "Did you notify her guardian?" Holmes asked. Dalton's eyes flashed. "Notify Edwin Whitmore, to have her dragged back like a disobedient child. Number I. She is family. I could not." Holmes's voice softened. "Then you have done the right thing." Dalton stared at him. "You mean you have not come to take her back?" Holmes shook his head. "I have come to ensure she is alive and not harmed. The rest is for Miss Whitmore to decide." Dalton exhaled, the breath leaving him like a burden. "She feared you would be sent to pursue her. She feared everything." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "She wrote that she was watched." Dalton nodded. "She said there were eyes in her own home, servants loyal to her uncle, accounts kept from her conversations that stopped when she entered a room, and then there was the marriage arrangement." "The match with Mr. Percival Hargreaves," Holmes said. Dalton gave a bitter laugh. "Yes, Edwin's prudent proposal. A man twice her age, with investments tied to Edwin's management. Clara said if she married him, her fortune would be managed forever, only now under a husband's hand as well as an uncle's." "And so she fled," I said. "She fled," Dalton agreed. "Because she reached the end of endurance. She said she wished to live without being bartered." Holmes turned his head slightly, listening. From upstairs came the faint creak of a floorboard, then stillness, as if someone had paused, holding their breath. Holmes spoke without raising his voice. "Miss Whitmore, you may come down. Dr. Watson will not bite, and I have no handcuffs." There was a long pause. Then, slowly, a footstep, light, careful, descended. A moment later, Clara Whitmore entered the room. She was younger than I had imagined, perhaps 4, and 20, with dark hair pinned simply and a face that combined delicacy with startling firmness. Her eyes were tired, yet in them burned a steady resolve. She wore a plain traveling dress, but even in that simplicity, there was an air of dignity that wealth could not purchase, and oppression could not quite extinguish. She looked at Holmes with guarded apprehension. "So," she said, "the famous Mr. Holmes." Holmes bowed slightly. "At your service, Miss Whitmore. You have found me quickly," she said. And though her tone was calm, I heard the tremor beneath. "You left me a letter," Holmes replied gently, "and a very well-constructed locked room. It would have been discourteous not to accept your invitation." Clara's lips tightened, then, to my surprise, curved into the faintest smile. "Then you understood. I did not wish to vanish forever. I wished only to vanish long enough to breathe." Holmes's gaze was intent. "You rehearsed it." She met his eyes steadily, for months. Dalton looked at her with a mixture of admiration and alarm. "Clara," she raised a hand. "Henry knows. He has sheltered me." Holmes nodded toward Dalton. "Mr. Dalton's house bears subtle signs of recent occupancy by a lady, a second teacup upon a tray, a shawl draped behind a screen. I confess I was relieved to find such evidence." Clara flushed slightly, half in embarrassment, half in defiance. "I did not intend to be careless." "You were not careless," Holmes replied. "You were merely human. The mind may plan like an architect, but the body still desires tea." Clara's shoulders eased fractionally. "Then you do not condemn me?" Holmes's expression grew grave. "That depends upon what you intended next." She drew a breath. "To leave England." "To where?" Holmes asked. "Wherever. Edwin cannot reach me," she replied. "France, perhaps. Or further. I have an account in my own name. Small but sufficient. I intended to travel under an assumed name until my majority, when I could act openly without being stopped. Dalton interjected anxiously. She meant no crime, she meant only freedom. Holmes's gaze remained upon Clara. No crime has been committed, he said, salve perhaps against expectation, and against the pride of those who think they may govern another life. Clara's eyes glistened for a moment, whether with relief or restrained emotion, I could not tell. But, Holmes continued, there is danger. Her face tightened. From Edwin. From anyone who benefits from your absence, Holmes replied. A vanishing heiress invites more than familial panic. It invites opportunists, false messengers, forged letters, unscrupulous men who would claim to protect you for a price. Clara nodded slowly. That is why I chose Henry. He is safe. Holmes inclined his head. And for the first time since the case began, I saw in him something like respect untinged by superiority. You have designed your escape with artistry, he said. The passage, the decoy, the staged stillness. It was admirable. Clara held his gaze. It was necessary. Holmes's voice softened. Then let us ensure it ends safely. Clara's eyes searched his. Will you tell Edwin? Holmes considered, then said quietly, I will tell him what is required to prevent foolish pursuit and scandal, but I will not deliver you to a cage. Clara exhaled. And in that exhalation I sensed the release of weeks, perhaps months, of silent strain. Outside, the Surrey rain tapped gently against the windowpane. Within, by the fire's warm glow, the mystery of the locked room had transformed into something more intimate and more perilous, the mystery of a woman's bid for autonomy in a world determined to define her. And Holmes, having followed her trail through hidden architecture and family discord, now faced the subtler task of guiding a resolution where logic must serve not only truth, but mercy. Chapter Igfe Truth revealed. We returned to Hampstead under a sky, the color of pewter, the train bearing us back toward London, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. No vanishing heiress, no hidden corridors, no family drama smoldering beneath polished manners. Yet in our compartment Clara Whitmore sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture composed, and I could see in the set of her jaw that she had crossed an invisible boundary, from which she did not intend to retreat. Holmes had insisted upon her return, not as a surrender, but as a conclusion. One may flee. He had told her with that quiet authority which even strong minds tend to respect. But if one wishes to be free, one must also be understood. A mystery unresolved is a lever. Others will pull at their convenience. Clara had consented. Henry Dalton accompanied us as far as the station, then remained in Surrey, unwilling, wisely, as Holmes put it, to become a visible participant in a family confrontation. Clara traveled under a veil, not from shame but from prudence, and Holmes arranged our arrival so that no newspaper boy nor curious neighbor might observe. At the Whitmore house we were admitted at once. The servants moved with the tense hush of a household whose very walls seemed to have learned silence. Mr. Edwin Whitmore received Holmes's message that morning, brief, authoritative, and devoid of explanation. Assemble the household at 3. I shall resolve the matter, nothing more. By the time we entered the drawing room, the Whitmores were already gathered. Mr. Edwin Whitmore stood by the mantel, his posture rigid, his face pale beneath its habitual composure. Arthur paced near the window, restless as ever, his anxiety now sharpened by hope and dread in equal measure. Mrs. Whitmore lay upon a chaise, her shawl drawn tight about her shoulders, her eyes large with strain. Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor, had been summoned as well, and sat stiffly upon a chair, fingers intertwined as though in prayer. The atmosphere was heavy, not with grief, but with anticipation, the kind of silence that precedes a verdict. Holmes entered first, calm as if he had come merely to call for tea. He took his place near the center of the room, removed his gloves, and surveyed the assembly with that steady gaze which made men feel as though their thoughts were written upon their faces. Mr. Whitmore, he began, you requested resolution. You shall have it. But I warn you, truth rarely arrives dressed in comfort. Widwin Whitmore's lips tightened. Where is my niece? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he turned to Arthur. "Mr. Arthur Whitmore," he said, "you have been agitated by this affair. I suspect you have also been agitated by other affairs, more private." Arthur's face flushed. "If you mean my debts, I mean precisely that," Holmes replied. "Your financial pressures are considerable, and your creditors not as discreet as you might hope. Yet let us establish one thing at once. You did not abduct Miss Whitmore." Arthur blinked. What? You lack the patience," Holmes said with clinical simplicity. "You lack the foresight, and you lack the physical inclination to crawl through a hidden passage and stage a room like a theater set. Your impulses run too quickly. You would have left disorder." Arthur's mouth opened, then shut. His indignation faltered, replaced by bewildered relief. Holmes's gaze shifted to Edwin. "Mr. Edwin Whitmore, you possess patience, you possess calculation, and you possess motive. Namely, the continued management of your niece's estate. You favored a marriage arrangement that would have consolidated control under your supervision, yet you too did not abduct her." Whitwin's eyes narrowed. "Then who did?" Holmes's voice remained measured. "No one. There was no abduction. There was no violence. There was only an escape rehearsed, deliberate, and executed with admirable precision." A faint sound escaped Mrs. Whitmore. Half gasp, half sob. Holmes continued, as though lecturing upon a case in some medical amphitheater. "Let us begin with the locked room. Miss Whitmore's door was found locked. From within, the key lay upon her writing desk. This was not a miracle. It was a decoy. The true exit lay above, hidden within the upper molding near the ceiling." He looked at Fenwick. "Mr. Fenwick, you have practiced in many old houses. You know the relics of past construction: servant passages, ventilation shafts, concealed panels. They were designed for invisibility." Fenwick swallowed. "Yes." Holmes turned back to the family. In Miss Whitmore's chamber stood a chair near her desk. It was slightly askew, an imperceptible detail, save that the carpet beneath bore older impressions, inconsistent with its present position. The chair had been moved after prolonged use, then placed deliberately to suggest interruption. He stepped toward the center of the room, as though the very space between them required demonstration. "By standing upon that chair," Holmes continued, "one may reach the cornice and locate a narrow ventilation grate, painted to match the plaster and nearly invisible from the floor. The screws showed signs of recent unscrewing, carefully replaced. Behind the grate lay a crawl, space leading into forgotten servant corridors." Arthur stared. His pacing halted. Edwin's face remained rigid, but I saw a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. Holmes's voice did not waver. "Within those passages we found chalk marks, guides for the hand in darkness, indicating rehearsal. We found a fragment of green upholstery thread caught upon a beam, matching the chair's damask. We found a fabric snag, dyed claret and edged in black, consistent with Miss Whitmore's evening shawl." Mrs. Whitmore's hands flew to her mouth. "Clara's shawl." "Yes," Holmes said, "and we found footprints. Light steps taken recently, then brushed aside with a careful hand. The passage ran downward to a sealed shaft that had been cleverly unsealed from within, its mortar loosened so that one informed could remove bricks silently. It led to a shed against the outer wall, and to a side gate opening toward Hampstead Heath, beyond the line of sight from the main entrance." He paused. His eyes rested now upon Edwin Whitmore with the steadiness of a scalpel. This route required practice to traverse swiftly and silently. Therefore, it was not a desperate improvisation. It was prepared over time. Edwin's voice came out hard. "Prepared by whom?" Holmes's reply was quiet. "By your niece." The silence that followed was profound. It was not the silence of surprise alone, but of something deeper. A realization settling into place, heavy and unavoidable. Arthur spoke first, his voice strained. "Clara did this." She staged it," Holmes nodded. "She staged the stillness. She arranged the room so that it would look too perfect, too calm. She left the half-written letter not as a cry of panic, but as a curtain, drawn to obscure the stage beyond. and to direct suspicion where she wished it. Fenwick found his voice at last. But why? Why would she cause such distress? Holmes's eyes softened slightly, but his tone remained clinical. She wrote of a necessary escape because she believed that open confrontation would place her at a disadvantage. He turned again to Edwin. Your ambitions and your son's debts were not the direct cause of her disappearance in the mechanical sense, but they were the environment that produced it. Your household's tensions served as camouflage. They made an abduction seem plausible. They made suspicion fall naturally upon family greed, and thus concealed the truer motive. Autonomy. Widwin's stern mask faltered at last. For a moment, the composure slipped, revealing something like shock, perhaps even wounded pride. You mean to say, he said slowly, that she fled because of us? Holmes's gaze did not soften. Not because you struck her, he replied, but because the psychological walls within this house had become higher than any brick. Arthur sank into a chair, his face pale. Mrs. Whitmore wept silently, her shoulders trembling. Holmes stepped back, as though completing the exposition of a proof. And now, he said quietly, since the mechanics are laid bare, we come to the human conclusion. He moved to the door and opened it. The servants outside, listening with wide eyes, drew back. Miss Whitmore, Holmes said, you may enter. Clara came in. She wore a simple traveling dress, her veil lifted. She stood with her shoulders squared, her expression resolute, yet touched by apprehension. For an instant, her gaze swept the room. Uncle, cousin, aunt, solicitor. And I saw the weight of that glance, a lifetime of being observed, now returned as observation. Mrs. Whitmore rose with a cry. Clara! Clara stepped forward and embraced her briefly, gently, as one might comfort without yielding. Then she faced Edwin. Uncle, she said, and her voice was steady, I did not mean to cause suffering, but I meant to end a different suffering, the quiet, endless one. Edwin's mouth opened, then closed. His authority seemed suddenly misplaced, like a key that no longer fit its lock. You had no right, Arthur burst out, then faltered under Clara's gaze. I had every right, Clara replied calmly. I am not property to be managed. I am not a fortune to be married into convenience. I am a person. Fenwick cleared his throat nervously. Miss Whitmore, this is most irregular. Clara turned to him, eyes bright. So is hiding my own accounts from me. So is arranging a marriage to preserve management. Widwin's voice came low. We sought only to protect you. Clara's expression softened for the first time, but only slightly. Protection that requires obedience is not protection, it is control. Holmes watched her with a quiet approval, as one watches a mind that has chosen reason over hysteria. I will claim my inheritance independently, Clara continued. I will appoint my own agent. I will review every account, and I will decide my own future, whether I marry, whom I marry, and when. The words fell into the room like the final stroke of a judge's gavel. Silence followed. Silence heavier than accusation, because it contained not only blame, but recognition. Edwin Whitmore stared at his niece for a long moment. Then, slowly, his shoulders sagged by a fraction, as if an internal struggle had ended not in victory, but in resignation. Holmes spoke softly, almost to himself. There has been no murder, he said. No kidnapping, only foresight. Clara looked at him. And will you condemn that? Holmes met her gaze evenly. I condemn only what is irrational, he replied. Your method was dramatic, but your logic was sound. Yet drama invites danger. I advise you now to replace secrecy with legality as swiftly as possible. Clara nodded once. That is why I returned. Holmes inclined his head, acknowledging both her courage and her calculation. Outside, the autumn wind pressed faintly against the windows. Within, the Whitmore family sat amid the ruins of their assumed order, confronted by a truth that no locked door could keep out, that a person's will, once awakened, is not easily contained. And, though no crime had been committed in the vulgar sense, something had nonetheless been broken in that drawing room. Something old, You dismissed the notion of murder early, I said. Holmes nodded. Because murder is clumsy. It requires concealment of a body, suppression of noise, coordination of accomplices. There was no such residue. Instead, there was order. Too much order. The perfection of the room disturbed me more than chaos would have done. He rose again and retrieved from the desk drawer a small object wrapped in paper. He unfolded it, the fragment of claret-colored fabric we had found in the passage, a thread caught upon a beam, he murmured. Proof not of violence, but of passage. He returned it carefully to its wrapping. Edwin Whitmore's ambitions, Holmes continued. And Arthur's debts provided motive enough for Clara's resolve, though neither had physically constrained her. The psychological walls built within that house were as real to her as iron bars. Yet iron bars leave marks, psychological ones leave silence. And so she answered silence with spectacle, I said. Precisely. Holmes resumed his seat and reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings in a low, contemplative note. There is another point worth observing, he added. Clara returned. Yes, I said. That surprised me. It should not have, Holmes replied. Her objective was not exile, but leverage. By disappearing, she forced confrontation. By returning openly, she transformed mystery into declaration. Had she remained hidden, she would have become rumor. By reappearing, she became decision. I considered the scene in the drawing room. The uncle's composure faltering, Arthur's indignation dissolving into confusion, Clara's steady voice claiming independence. You believe Edwin will yield? I asked. He will adapt, Holmes said. Men of his temperament prefer order. Clara has made it clear that order now requires her consent. The solicitor will revise the trusteeship, the accounts will be examined, and the proposed marriage to Mr. Hargreaves will quietly evaporate. Holmes lowered the violin. In the end, he said, the affair was not one of crime but of control. Yet control, when exercised without awareness, can be as oppressive as overt cruelty. Clara perceived the cage long before she resolved to leave it. I walked to the window and looked out upon the London street. A child chased a hoop along the pavement. A flower seller adjusted her basket. Life moved without drama, unaware of the subtler imprisonments behind closed doors. For my own part, I said slowly, I could not help but admire her courage. Yet I pity the strain it left behind. Families are not easily rebuilt once their foundations crack. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. True, he said, but sometimes the crack reveals that the foundation required alteration. A structure that depends upon silence will eventually fail. Better to rebuild while the walls still stand. He rose and placed the violin aside. Thus ended, he said quietly, the affair of the Vanishing Heiress of Hampstead. He paused, then added, a reminder, Watson, that some imprisonments leave no visible bars, and some escapes require neither violence nor noise, only resolve, rehearsal, and the courage to step into the hidden passage. The fire snapped softly in the grate. Outside, the evening deepened, and as I set down these events for the record, I reflect that not all mysteries conclude with handcuffs and confession. Some conclude with understanding, an understanding that liberty, once claimed, may echo louder than any cry for help. In that lies both the peril and the promise of independence.